Views expressed in the following program are those of the individual authors and participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University, the United States Air Force, the Air Command and Staff College, or the Department of Defense.
Hello and welcome everybody. We're excited to be joined by Dr. Dean and Kruzer today from the Air War College in Montgomery. And today we're going to be talking about Syria and what we should know about the current conflict and what's going on. So I'd like to start off asking Dr. Dean, given the surprise that everyone has about the Syrian conflict erupting. This is nothing new, though. This has been a long time building. Would you mind letting people know what you think they should about the history of the conflict?
Sure. Syria was a sandjack of the Ottoman Empire. After World War I, it became a French protectorate. It separated Syria and Lebanon. One of the first Arab nationalist rebellion happened in 1925. You've got French bombing Damascus, an urban aerial campaign in 1925. So the bombing of Damascus is nothing new today. After World War II and the rise of nationalism in Syria, you have a guy named Hafez Assad, who becomes dictator, and he's of the Alawite group in northwest Syria, who the French had set up to be in power. And he will have, throughout the 70s and 80s, numerous, particularly Islamist, Salafist rebellions inside his country, and he'll put them down with great brutality. So in 2011, when the civil war broke out, his son, Bashar Assad, just thought the same thing and thought he could easily put them down.
Excellent. Dr. Kruzer, thank you for joining us. What should we know about Syria today?
Well, Syria today is a central focus in the foreign policy, not just of the United States, but of many countries around the world. For the past several hundred years, the Middle East has always become prominent. We keep wanting to move away from it. We talk about pivoting to the Pacific or to other crises in the world. But every crisis area that we're seeing right now is tied in one way or another to the conflict that's ongoing in Syria, that's right now somewhat frozen, but could at any given time flare up again. The Russians' interests there are high with their need for warm water ports, just as what's going on in Ukraine is deeply tied to Sevastopol. The fighting for the Russians, they care very much about what happens in Tartus. Every neighboring state in Syria has an interest, so of course you've got the Israelis and the Iraqis, who we're still closely tied with as well. They have interest there as well. The Saudis, and the Iranians, of course. And all these different interests, all these different groups there have different interests for being there. Some of them, it does make for some interesting bedfellows at different times, because a lot of times it's very short-term, important, vital security interests. So you sometimes see partnerships, at least on a temporary basis, that you wouldn't see at any given times, especially when we try to look at it through our American lens, which tends to look at ideologies, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, and who we should support from a moral lens, because it's a lot more complicated process than that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Dr. Kruzer, I'd like to ask you, you mentioned that the Russians are in Syria, we're in Syria, we're facing off in Ukraine, and there's been a lot of concern about escalation there, but escalation is also a concern in Syria itself. Mm-hmm. Could you talk about methods to avoid direct conflict between the U.S. and Russia in Syria?
Yeah, well, certainly because we've had operations going on in the past, there's some stuff we can, and there's a lot of stuff still going on to this day that we'd be limited to talk about. But I think what you're getting to, the most interesting case study for this and talking about moving forward is, like I said, strange bedfellows these conflicts can make. One of the things that was not talked about in that list I gave the last answer was ISIS. So of course ISIS was a major factor in the Syria civil war between 2015 and 2019. And this was a case where even though the U.S. and Russia are at a standoff over the 2014 invasion in Ukraine and other issues around the world, and frankly Russia's support to Assad previously, we are at this point able to work with the Russians specifically because the more immediate threat posed by ISIS brings our interest in that region into alignment. So there was some direct and some indirect conversations between the U.S. and Russia specifically over airspace deconfliction at that point in time. Sometimes we'd be flying, sometimes the Russians would be flying, so how we could communicate times of day and places on the map and have that signal go out to say we're flying this but we're doing it against ISIS, and both would stand down to let the other side do what needed to be done in that particular thing. There's still the potential for escalation elsewhere in the country when other issues flare up, but on those specific zones there is again a higher overarching interest that both sides see the need to cooperate on to avoid escalation there accidentally.
Yeah. Dr. Dean, as we look at Syria today, a lot of the present conflict was originated in the Arab Spring. Can you talk about that process where the revolution actually occurs and how we ended up seeing the current fighting that's now present still in Syria?
Yeah, a lot of the revolution that occurs in 2011, the Civil War, has deep roots. It has deep roots, dissatisfaction. When his father, Hafez Assad, dies in 2000, all the world had great hope. We had American politicians going to see him. He was a physician, London trained, seemed Western and liberal. He wanted to bring liberal reforms. But his own intelligence service, the Mukhabarat, told him he could not do this or he'd be removed, like we saw with Sadat in '81. And so he maintains some of this. Then the U.S. invasion in Iraq makes it worse. And any possibility of rapprochement becomes more and more difficult. His real central mistake was harboring foreign fighters. He enabled foreign fighters to go into Iraq and places like Tal al-Afar, making the conflict worse, facilitating Hezbollah in Iraq. And so when this revolution came, nobody had any sympathy for him. There were other things that helped cause it, economic causes, disparities between the rich and the poor, drought. If you look throughout the history of Syria, almost every civil war insurgency is always preceded by drought. The politics of water is a big deal. You really see kind of what we call the J-curve theory in history, rising expectations that are cut off, and to see so much potential with Bashar Assad. And now, like, it's who to support. You know, he's using poison gas starting in 2012 against his own people. But then we see al-Nusra Front, we see ISIS, we other bad actors, and it's like, who do we support now? You know, we're not enthusiastic about now the removal of Assad, that maybe he can stay there. We can figure a way to stabilize the country and hopefully someday rebuild it.
So I guess I'll throw this question to both of you. Sitting here in the United States, we often get asked, why should we care about something that's happening on the other side of the world? Why do we need to care about what's happening in Syria and the current mess and stalemate that is occurring that you talked about, Dr. Dean? But why should we really care about it?
Well, part of the mess and the stalemate stems from the American people really and our policymakers asking that very question, because it's both a question of what are our interests there, and two, if we do decide that we needed to intervene, what's the best way to go about this? So back in that, when Bill was talking about that 2012, 2013 time frame, the beginning of the Obama second term time frame, that's when we really first seriously looked at it, because you have groups of policymakers across the political spectrums, either neoconservative or hardcore realists on the right who see a power vacuum that can be filled, or liberal hegemons on the left who see values and human rights at stake that need to be enforced. They're all advocating for intervention. But this is also when we've just pulled out of Iraq. It's right before ISIS is going to kick off. It's when we're hoping still to get out of Afghanistan. So we don't know that we should intervene. And so the short-term answer then was, to a degree, the air power easy button. Let's set up a no-fly zone. Let's do what we can to dial back the violence. And then with that, hopefully that'll give the Free Syrian Army enough cover to make gains and ultimately bring down the regime. This, though, I had to point out at the time, was filled with problems, because there's too much risk of accidental escalation and accidentally drawing us into that. And so to a degree, we still have this massive confusing standoff going on because we didn't know how to intervene then and we didn't have the will to intervene then. And we're frankly still at that point. I mean, all attention's focused on Ukraine, and so a lot of people are watching that, wondering, should we intervene, should we escalate, should we pull out? We don't have a good answer for that right now. But the danger is all these conflicts are ultimately connected because we are seeing the interests of all these great world powers coming into conflict. And so, I mean, as Trotsky said, you may not be interested in war, but it's interested in you. And that's really what we could be potentially looking at here, is that international politics keeps moving and all these interests are hitting each other head on in Syria, whether we like it or not. And so we need to pay attention, and we need to make sure that to what extent we intervene is to hedge off the growth of violence there, because we don't want it spiraling into a bigger conflict.
One of the things we see happening in Syria is a culmination of experimentations and military operations. One of the things we learned to do in the Battle of Mosul was to use proxy forces, but to use Americans to support air power and a new conception of war. The U.S. Army has something now called JGIC, Joint Air-Ground Integration Cells, where you no longer think in terms of air-ground operations, but you think in terms of fixed wing, helicopters, drones, and HIMAR long-range artillery that has a very long, precise range. And Michael Gordon argues in his book, Degrade and Destroy, we kind of bring together some of the things we learned in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we've applied them. And now they're getting applied to a conventional war. Some of the argumentation is being made that what we learned how to do in the Battle of Mosul and throughout Syria is now paying dividends in Iraq, and that there is going on inside the United States Army right now an entire revolutionary new way of thinking about war, drawing from the lessons of irregular war, drawing from the lessons of Syria and all that. Of course, it also creates strategic overstretch for the Russians. The Russians have Spetsnaz there, they have the Wagner Group, and they have mostly air power operating there. But they're also operating in Niger, they've launched a coup there, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic. So as Russia becomes more and more desperate for soldiers, is this going to weaken their operations significantly in Syria? So we can see things like Ukraine and Syria linked together.
Yeah, I would like to ask how American policy has changed through the last several administrations, because we look at Syria, we became involved in really heavily during the Obama administration. The Syrians used chemical weapons. Obama had set a red line. We did not react as promised. And then Trump came in and tried to withdraw from Syria, but ultimately failed. And now with the Biden administration, we seem to have some kind of strategic confusion as to what exactly we're doing over the long haul. My question for both of you is, how has the American policy towards Syria changed over time? And what were the major changes from Obama to Trump and from Trump to Biden?
I think it's a history of missed opportunities. Hafez Assad had been in bed with the Soviets starting in the mid-60s onward. When the Soviets fell, there was one opportunity. There was times a kind of brief rapprochement, but the man was so damn brutal with his own people that it made it difficult, particularly for those interested in human rights. Then again, when his son came in, an opportunity to fix things, and our invasion in Iraq had a lot of consequences. It not only lost political legitimacy in this country with the failed WMD search, but it also alienated the people in the area, and it scared a lot of people. Our operations in both Iraq and Libya have scared the neighborhood. The Russians have seen the Americans are willing to go in and overthrow regimes, both Republicans and Democrats, and it's played into their calculus as well. And after that, Assad felt no need to trust the United States. So the first thing we have to do is reduce trust. We have to improve trust, reduce fear, and reduce the number of players in the area. Iran is exhausted from this conflict. For all the talk about how we wore ourselves out and Iran is dominant in Iraq, Iran has worn itself out in Syria, and Hezbollah has weakened its own credibility in Lebanon.
I think that Yeah, to a large degree, I'll agree with Bill, but we talk about this problem a lot, and this question, it's one of the first things we pose to our students in international security, is this question about continuity versus change in American foreign policy. Because with every election, there's always big talk of change. Obama was going to be a sweeping change from Bush, and then Trump was going to be a sweeping change from Obama. But despite the rhetoric and despite how it's played in most domestic audiences, we do see a lot of continuity. And a lot of the problems, as I mentioned, from Syria is we have seen a fairly consistent policy of we want to intervene, we want to recognize what's going on, but the best we can do is name and shame and use international audiences to draw a line around what's happening. But at the same time, there isn't much will to intervene directly because it's right now, as long as the war stays where it is, it's kind of a tertiary interest to the United States and not really a direct interest to pulling many people in. Now, as we watch that opportunity, different people who are intervening are doing it in different ways than, again, we might suspect because it's potentially problematic for their policy. I mean, you look at Israel on the one hand, they stayed largely on the sidelines very early on because as bad as Assad was, and despite the fact that there is no partnership there in terms of a peace agreement like there is with Egypt or elsewhere, Assad is still, at least in 2012-2014 timeframe, was seen as a better bet than the possibility of the Takfiris coming up and taking charge in Syria at the time. The devil they knew was better than the devil they didn't. I talked about Russia and the United States in Syria. There wasn't the coordination at all, but there was kind of a tacit recognition that both the United States and the Iranians have a basic alignment of interest in Iraq at that same time frame in 2015. So there wasn't the direct correlation, but there was definitely watching each other and kind of accepting, okay, if Iranians move through the mountains in this area and we move up the Tigris Valley, then we have the best bet of turning the tide against ISIS faster. And so these kind of things are the tactics there, and what's happening at that tactical to operational level of war is driving a lot of what's happening. But policy-wise, we see remarkable consistency across these administrations on what's happening.
I would like to follow up. We've mentioned strange bedfellows as a comment earlier. We've mentioned a lot of the actors. We've talked about Russia. We've talked about the United States. Could you tell us who we need to know about in the region that are actors that we should be concerned about given the Syrian conflict?
Oh, there's any number of actors you need to be concerned with. I think we've only got a little over 10 minutes left, so I can't really start with that. But Bill, I'll let you start.
I would say the biggest threat is Iran. And one of the things I'm concerned about in Iran, particularly with all the riots inside the country, is the regime imploding and having a civil war inside a country that's trying to develop nuclear weapons. I think Iran has been weakened by its partnership with Syria. I think they've got so many domestic problems and they don't know which way to turn. So I would worry about them. I also would worry about problems inside Saudi Arabia that has a lot of domestic discontent inside the country, and they're always unsure of their place. I think the current administration is trying to figure out how to deal with Saudi Arabia. A lot of people dislike the Saudis, but they need the Saudis. And so how do we assess that relationship as well? And Turkey is a complex relationship. On the one hand, we're trying to contain them. On the other hand, we try to maintain them as NATO allies.
Yeah. So you mentioned Iran, and Iran is particularly interesting to watch, especially right now with respect to this conflict, because like so many other conflicts in the Middle East, they don't directly intervene through their own military action, but they rely on the Quds Force and their proxy forces, most notably Lebanese Hezbollah, but there's a number of others out there too. And so this again gets to the complications of the matter. So I was in Iraq in 2019 and 2020 when we famously launched a strike and killed General Soleimani. Now, make no mistake, I'm not upset by any means that this man is gone. He killed plenty of friends of mine over the years. So in that regard, I totally understand what's happening. But there's always this question mark over him because the problem is Iran has always played a dangerous game when working with their proxy forces. And so the main argument against taking out Soleimani is that he's the one man who is in position to control all these different factions and who they will all turn to. The minute he's gone, though, it's hard to say how much control Iran really has over the militias anymore and how much the tail wags the dog. Just like, as Bill, we were talking before this about the potential problems of when you invest in proxy forces elsewhere in the world, like if you look at Ukraine or something like that, how much that can accidentally pull us into things. They were in the exact same situations where they have all these different groups out there. Last I checked, there were at least 20, 25 major Shia militia that had the support in some level or another of the Iranian regime that was active. When Soleimani was there, he could somewhat coordinate and control them. And again, it's the devil we know versus the devil we don't know. Now that's a problem. Likewise in Syria, we've got a number of factions that have come out of the breakup of the Free Syrian Army, the Syrian Democratic Front being the most prominent of them. But you've also got a number of other factions running around. What formerly the al-Nusra Front, I think most recently they're going under the name Tahrir al-Sham. That's a potentially very dangerous one. Back when then General Austin famously said that ISIS was the second string, his main point there was that ISIS was basically the hotheads who wanted to act now. They were certainly dangerous, but they weren't quite, in the eyes of many people, as sophisticated as what Tahrir al-Sham, then the al-Nusra Front, was, who we thought had a much more long-term plan and was going to be more dangerous in the long term. They're still lingering out there as al-Qaeda's main affiliate in the region. And then you've also got a number of other minor actors running around that continue to garble this battle space.
What we see really is the legacy of European colonialism. It's a constructed state. The French put together the state. They consulted and used the minorities. They had a divide and rule situation. It's not an accident the Assad family is in the position it's in. It's not an accident that a huge chunk of the military and intelligence services are Alawites and all that. And so you see this throughout the world. You see it in Africa. You see it in the Middle East. I mean, it's not an accident. Al-Baghdadi said from the Mosul Mosque that he wanted to undo Sykes-Picot, where in 1916 the French and the British divided the Middle East between them, created artificial states like Iraq. Iraq has created the Cairo Conference in 1920 by Winston Churchill. A lot of these states are constructed, to use the language of the postmodernist, states, and it's a real problem, and it's a long-lasting problem. We have not fundamentally solved the problems of the First World War, and so we're not going to solve them quickly. What we want to do is restore stability, and if we restore stability, we can leave, because we're desperate to leave the Middle East, but the Middle East won't let us go. We thought we were out of Iraq, we were back in Iraq, and we're still in the neighborhood. We're still there. We're worried more about first China and then Russia. We don't like being held in the Middle East, but I don't see any clear, easy way out.
I have a question. What are some of the external threats to the rest of the world from the Syrian conflict? Do you remember the major terrorist attacks in France that were that saw people who were embedded within the refugee community that came in and really caused chaos in Paris? But there are a lot of other conflicts that, for example, I think that some of the fighters have been recruited to go into Ukraine, also within Armenia and Azerbaijan. What are the threats that we see in the rest of the world from the current conflict in Syria?
Yeah, so if nothing else, that's another example to why we need to care about this, because it might be, as a whole, a lower level issue, but it just, when it comes to, like you say, one spectacular terrorist attack can change everything's equation. No, very few people in America were watching Afghanistan or bin Laden before the 9/11 attacks happened. Plenty of people were. It gets downplayed about how much we were watching them, but we were in early 2001. It was all China all the time back then because we were pivoting to Asia, and then we get pulled into Afghanistan. So there's the prospect for that, and yes, it has happened. I do think, especially when tied to the refugees, I think it gets a little bit overplayed. It can happen, but in general, any of these hot war zones become, to a degree, a training ground for people, and to a degree, a testing ground for new weapons. Everything that you're seeing the Ukrainians do right now against the Russians was in part learned from that Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict of the 2020 timeframe. So they've basically done that and put it on steroids, buying some equipment from the Turks and getting some training and some integration from Western allies. So we're seeing that. We see anytime you have the situation If you want like Wagner Group or any number of other terrorist or insurgent groups, if there's a war being fought in a place like Syria, that's a great place to send them to get some credibility and some testing, and then you can pull them back to send them somewhere else. So if nothing else, for what we're learning in terms of the ongoing evolution of the character of war or the potential for recruiting grounds and training grounds for future potential adversaries, you need to watch for all those things.
My concern is outside the neighborhood. One of the things we have looked at and been concerned is movement of terrorists from West Africa to the Caribbean littoral. That area in the Atlantic is not well protected. The Mauritanians don't have much of a navy. We've tried to help them with different things. We've done some foreign internal defense in the area. But we have a rogue state in Venezuela. And Venezuela invites lots of bad actors inside the country. We're concerned about the training of Hezbollah in the Caribbean littoral and their movement. And we've left the back door open. We've closed our bases. We've closed Howard Air Force Base. We've closed Fort Sherman. We've closed Vieques for training of Special Forces Group. We've closed Roosevelt Roads. All we have left is Soto Cano and Tegucigalpa. We've had all our attention on Colombia, but there are other potential problems in the region, and so there's been some scholars and intelligence analysts that have looked at the movement between West Africa and the Caribbean littoral. So Hezbollah has carried out operations in Argentina and South America. I regard them as one of the most dangerous terrorist groups in the world.
I want to allow each of you to address something that you feel that we haven't had a chance to address yet. So what are we missing that's important that you think we should have as a takeaway from this program?
I think the main takeaway from the Syria crisis is, again, the complexity of the international environment and the danger we run into, especially when we talk about the unipolar moment or we talk about American power, the dangers that can happen if we potentially overestimate that and misunderstand the scenario. Because like I say, the American way of war, we like to see as good versus evil, good versus bad. That was true against the communists or against Al-Qaeda, whichever else it is. War almost takes on a crusader-like attitude for democracy and freedom. And it's very simple, and we want to go in there with overwhelming force. And Syria is one of those complex situations where there are so many actors with so many interests and so many entanglements that it's problematic. One of our most important allies in Syria, especially against ISIS, was the Kurds in the north. And that was a very important partnership, but hop over the border from there and the Kurds are the biggest adversary of one of our key NATO allies in Turkey. And so that situation alone causes potential numerous headaches for us. When some people talk about a solution to the area, as Bill said, oh, the map was artificial, so let's look at rewriting a map. Well, redrawing maps have never worked well historically either, be it Northern Ireland, be it India-Pakistan, be it Israel-Palestine. It's problematic, and if you try to redraw some of these maps, one, the countries that exist there aren't going to like it, but two, it's not always going to work well because the Kurds in Turkey and the Kurds in Syria and in Iraq are, frankly, in a number of ways, different peoples. The legacy of the Cold War led to different backings and different cultures to develop. So all the so-called simple answers are often worse than where we're at right now.
I think right now we don't have a clear policy. We don't have a clear policy because we're distracted by other things. I think we are focusing too much on China. China is important. It's a serious adversary, and we have to focus on Ukraine, but we have to look at other things. We have to balance how we fight. We have to be able to walk and chew gum. We have to have capability in conventional world and fighting irregular warfare as well. And I think Syria, the complexity of Syria makes it important, but extraordinarily difficult to make any clear, coherent policy. But what we shouldn't do is forget the importance of the Syrian campaign.
Excellent. Thank you both.
Thank
Dr.
you both,
Kruzer,
yes.
Dr. Dean. It was a great honor to have you join us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.